I've heard a couple times the perspective of civilians who 9/11 happened and that motivated them to get in the military. I want to hear
Sure.
the perspective of an officer who was in the military.
Sure.
And then boom, 9/11 happened. What goes through your mind when that happens?
Obviously, 9/11 is a huge destabilizing force. And truthfully, I thought was going to be the major destabilizing force in our world and certainly in our country, at least during my lifetime. Turns out probably not the case. But to the degree that it affected the stability of our nation and our military's involvement overseas, it was something that I wasn't necessarily prepared for. But again, I would advise young people that, really the purpose that our military serves is to serve our national interests overseas. And destabilizing events like this happen. And at the end of the day, when you raise your right hand to take that oath, the expectation is that you may be called to do something of this nature, right? And so as far as my experience when 9/11 happened, looking at it from a perspective that's now almost 20 years removed, is that 9/11, to the degree that it was a very terrible event, and we would hope that nothing like that ever repeats itself, is a validation for the training and really for the purpose. One of the other analogies I use is that on a daily basis at the firehouse, we train to combat structure fires, right? We train to put out fires that occur in people's homes, not only to save their lives, but to protect their property. And even though we hope and wish that that never befalls anyone, the reality of our world is that it does happen. And that when it does, we are as capable as possible to answer that call. Again, we talk about all those things like teamwork, critical decision-making, athletic ability, right? And those all combine to make me not only a Marine Corps officer, but a firefighter. When you have the opportunity to validate those things in what is really the most challenging possible arena, it inspires me personally. And then the opportunity to hopefully do good for other people through that channel is something it's unbeatable in my mind.
When I talked to Blake and Toby, who joined after 9/11, I mean, they joined the Marine Corps. They were virtually guaranteed to go to a combat zone. For people like you that were already in the military, that's not necessarily, I mean, you did sign up for it in a way, but when you signed up, you didn't know that you were actually going to go to battle. And so I'm real curious to know, I would imagine there were some people that were like, hey, this is not really what I necessarily signed up for. And then there were probably other people that were like, okay, now I get to test my skills and my training and see if what I've been doing will work in the real world.
And I think in the lead up to that time frame, Brian, to answer your question, in between the time when I eventually deployed in 2004 to 2001, there's a pretty long time frame in there where it's like, hey, what is actually going to happen when I see combat? How will I react? And I give huge credit to people like Toby who decided to sign up knowing full well what was at stake. From my perspective, you go into it really wondering how you're gonna stack up, right? And I think it was a great leadership challenge for me to know that I had Marines and sailors in my charge who all of a sudden, the situation in the world changes and they're like, I don't know. The other interesting part is like a lot of people are seeking out that combat scenario, not necessarily for the accolades, and certainly, at least hopefully, not from the perspective of, hey, I want to injure or kill someone else, another human being, but from the perspective of how do I measure up, right? And how do I face the challenge? And you go overseas and the level of test that you face or the level of involvement that you have is still largely up to chance. I think a lot of people, maybe sign up with the expectation of, especially if it's in wartime, of like, man, I'm really going to go out there and I'm going to test myself. And then you end up driving a computer. You know what I mean? It might be stateside. It might be in Europe somewhere. It might be, Iraq, Afghanistan. Who knows? I think the unifying factor in all of these things is the concept of service and quite possibly the concept of, hey, I'm going to test myself, right? The difference is that everybody's individual experience, whether you talk to Toby or your friend Blake or myself, is that even if we all went overseas at the same time, even though Toby and I shared a room together, his experience is going to be fundamentally different than my experience. And whether or not we come back with a satisfaction over whether or not we've sort of met the challenge that we anticipated, or that we still feel like there's something that needs to be done, either in terms of testing yourself out or in terms of service to your fellow man, is something that I think is still the big question that remains.